I'm Big Don Luka, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
Today, we are going to be wrapping up the regular season for the Dallas Mavericks. Not going to dive too heavily into the Mavericks' past two games against both the Detroit Pistons and, of course, against the Oklahoma City Thunder and their, two last games after they subsequently sat Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving out, because obviously those two games are, very much outliers in the sense that the Mavericks obviously weren't even trying to win the game for the most part, or, didn't care about the results of the game, I guess would be a better way of phrasing that. But nonetheless, obviously we'll talk a tiny bit about those games and, how the Mavericks finished off the regular season. But more at large here, we will be getting into the Mavericks' first round matchup versus the Los Angeles Clippers. This is something that has been locked in practically for almost maybe 2 weeks. The fact that these two teams would play, but there was a little bit of uncertainty as to who would get home court advantage. Even though the Clippers had a couple games lead on Dallas throughout most of that span, seemed like the Mavericks could maybe win enough games to get to that 4 seed, but unfortunately the Clippers closed the season on a high note, and the Mavericks were not able to do so. But regardless, this is still a extremely highly anticipated matchup. The third time that these teams are playing within the last
5 seasons.
Yeah, 5 seasons.
Yeah.
Since in the first round of the playoffs. Obviously, they played in consecutive years against each other in the bubble in 2020, and then the following year, the post-COVID year in 2021. And now, a few years later, the Mavericks are, getting the remains of this, not, I wouldn't label them as an old team, because I think that would undermine just how, good this Clippers roster is. But they are sort of getting the remains of a, much more fresh Los Angeles Clippers team a couple years ago that unfortunately was never really able to capitalize upon their potential due to injuries to Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. That 2021 series after they beat the Mavericks in 7 games might have been their best shot to get to the finals. And of course, Kawhi got hurt in the second round that year. So this is giving me, big Death Star 2 vibes for the Mavericks here. They're taking on the Empire once again. But I do feel as if, despite, James Harden coming over, I guess we can label him the Emperor. They are a lot more weak, a lot more brittle as a whole this time around.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this team, speaking to their weakness, to their
You like that
brittleness.
analogy?
Yeah, I did like that analogy. But speaking to their health concerns, this team has been its most unhealthiest throughout one of the most important stretches, which is obviously trying to get into the playoffs and that late season playoff push. It's uncertain. I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, obviously, but it's uncertain to where, if Kawhi will be ready for game one. It's uncertain if James Harden or even Paul George will be ready for game one. So the Mavericks could catch the Clippers at least early in the playoff series on a low end Clippers roster. We'll see at the end of the day, obviously, but only time will tell. But I would say out of any playoff matchup that Mavericks fans have wanted, outside of a Phoenix Suns rematch, this was probably the number one choice. Obviously, in 2021, it was a 5 versus 4 seed with the Clippers having home court advantage. The Mavericks took the first 2 games there, and pretty much every single team won their away games besides Game 7, where obviously the Clippers took care of business against the Mavs in Game 7 on their home floor. Anything could have happened, obviously, but we enter a new season. This is probably the Mavericks' best shot at beating. No, this is undoubtedly the Mavericks' best shot at beating Clippers for the first time. They obviously have the best roster around them. Kyrie Irving, PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford, you name it. It's pretty much every player on this Mavericks roster and within this Mavericks rotation is better than any other player was at that time at 2021 and 2020, which is kind of funny to think about. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. Obviously, they'll tip off and start their series on Sunday. We don't know what time it is, obviously, but Sunday will be the first game of seven, or presumably seven out of the between these two.
Yes, and it will be in Los Angeles, though. We do know that
Yes.
much.
Yes.
So we'll be, extremely excited to see Intuit Dome. And or is that not?
Maybe we'll send them packing to the Intuit Dome a little bit early.
Oh no, okay, I'm
Yeah.
tripping. Yeah, I for
They're
some
still in
reason,
crypto.com arena. Or
yes,
they didn't even
they
call it
this is
crypto
their
yet.
last season in
Yes.
Crypto.com Arena.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, I thought the Clippers had moved into their new arena, but the design concepts for it and the whole fan wall thing, at least the Mavericks are avoiding that this year because that does not
Well,
seem like it would be fun on
well,
opposing team
for
freaking.
for the one time that we will travel to LA and go to a Clippers and Mavericks game, we will not be allowed to enter the fan wall or fan zone, whatever they call it, because you have to be wearing Clippers gears
That's correct, Jaren.
if you want to sit in that little complex. I'll
Yes,
call
a
it.
very discriminatory gesture by Steve Ballmer,
Yes.
but
Yes.
at the end of the day, I'm not gonna get too political with the Intuit Dome here because I didn't as much outstanding amount of resentment that I have towards the Clippers and their fan base. you know I don't think that I could even take it to sit in the fan wall. So
Yeah, without about. Well, actually, we have breaking news here. This is
uh,
live reporting, mainstream breaking news. 11 of the 12 USA basketball roster finalists or players on that team was announced, and one of them is not Kyrie. This is just blasphemy. And yeah,
this
that's all I
is
wanted to say. So,
no, that's interesting. I wonder what the behind the scenes aspects of that decision making process was.
yeah.
Because Kyrie was obviously heavily rumored to be joining USA on the Olympic stage in
Let me
basketball.
make sure I read that right because I did not see Kyrie Irving in there. But yeah, no, he's not. He's not in there. So
Is Joel Embiid on there?
yeah, Joel Embiid's on there, and
That's
Anthony
crazy.
Davis, and Bam Adebayo. Ooh, they got some big men this year.
And they're gonna have some size.
Yeah. They didn't
Yeah.
have that like for the last like 8 years, but now they do.
No, they
So
did not. All right. Well, we're
um
getting a little off
yeah.
topic now. It is a very fun time to be a basketball fan. I think excitement is at an all-time high as we head into these playoffs without a doubt. So, forgive Jaren and I for, already forecasting into the USA summer basketball. It is the Olympics this year, so obviously, um, always interesting to take a look at that. But we did have our fair share of international coverage last year with Slovenia before we shut the podcast down. So, we hope to resume that soon. But regardless, we will catch you guys after the break. Of course, not the ad break. Hopefully, we
Not the ad breaking
do
him.
get the ad back soon. But yes, we will be diving into everything in regards to our preview for this Mavericks Clippers first round matchup. As well as like we said, talking a little bit about the Mavericks last two games. All right, Jaren. So getting into it, no pun intended, getting into it, Dome, as we were just talking about that for the intro. Nonetheless, we'll go ahead and do a little bit of a synopsis on the Mavericks' last two games, like we talked about, as we would do in the intro. Obviously, the Mavericks played both the Pistons and the Oklahoma City Thunder in the game versus the Pistons. They obviously were without Luka and Kyrie, and the game versus the Thunder on the road they sat practically their whole entire lineup. Giving guys at the back end of the rotation, such as AJ Lawson, Alex Fudge, Omax, and whatnot, all got to, really get some shine. Some, playing for an entire game versus, just a small stretch. I mean, it was Alex Fudge. It was his first Dallas Mavericks minutes, not his first NBA minutes. He had, played a little bit with the Lakers earlier this season. We also got to see kind of an extensive run on Brandon Williams as well. Forgot to mention him. But yeah, barring that, the Mavericks got absolutely curb stomped in that game versus the Thunder. I believe the Thunder had a 58-point lead at one time. It was pretty shameful, even though, it does not matter in any capacity. The Pistons game, the Mavericks lost by 18. Obviously, the Mavericks were playing with a little bit more, intent in that one, given that they did play a few of their starters throughout the first half. But the second half was very comparable to how the Mavericks operated in that Thunder game when they were just playing most of the guys at the end of the rotation and whatnot. Um, Jaren, I'll go ahead and just start off with this question before we even get into the games. Should the Mavericks take, any shame as an organization, for the, um, not putting any of their players on the court in these last two games, not trying to win these games? Obviously, I believe there was still a brief chance that they could have got to the 4 seed, but they relinquished that opportunity, upon, sitting Luka and Kyrie in that Pistons game. They weren't able to get over the hump anyways. Should the Mavericks feel guilty at all about this?
I think from the perspective of health and the perspective of the fact that we're already locked in a playoff series versus the Los Angeles Clippers, I don't think that we should take any shame in this. Obviously it's embarrassing losing to the Pistons, and it's embarrassing losing in almost 50-point fashion. Like that's just pretty explainable.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is context whenever it comes to that. As I said, pretty much as I started that sentence, health is always, a major concern, or health is always, of importance, especially headed into such an important playoff series. Um, they obviously didn't want to risk Luka. They obviously didn't want to risk Kyrie. I know Kyrie before this sort of 2-game stretch even mentioned that he was looking forward to the rest that he was going to get before the playoffs. So I think it was kind of written in stone that those two were going to be for sure out of the lineup. And then obviously, you know, players trickled in and out as first off, as the first half ended against the Pistons, we saw less and less guys. We saw more and more of AJ Lawson, Alex Fudge, those guys at the back half of the roster. And then obviously in the second half, we saw a lot more of them and a lot less of the rotational guys. And then obviously against the Thunder, the only two rotational guys that were really in the game were Tim Hardaway and Josh Green, who, if you're going to have any concern, it's going to be for those two. And those two had some pretty awful games. Tim Hardaway, I want to say, was 1 of 11 or 1 of 12 in that
He was
first
one of
half. I only
nine in
played the
the.
first.
I know he's 1 of 9 the second game versus OKC.
Yeah, well, I know he only played in the first half. I'm pretty sure, maybe a little bit in the third, early
Yeah.
third. And then Josh Green, I'm not going to take too much credence into his performance just because he's still getting into game shape. But I mean, the offense has looked rough to say the least. Even defensively, it's looked pretty questionable at times. I know the Thunder didn't have anybody out. They obviously took their guys out after the first half, but
And
yeah,
we will obviously just I'll in a quick interruption. The Thunder obviously or were trying to win this game. They
yeah,
were
they were, yeah.
still
So they had
jousting for the first seed in
yes.
the West. So I mean, they were not similar to the Mavericks in the sense of their competition level. I mean, regardless of who the Mavericks put out there, they're still NBA players. They're still going to go full throttle if there's any sort of meaningful seeding implications at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for the Mavericks perspective, at least in this game against the Thunder, they obviously wanted to lose this game. I know from a fan's perspective, like ourselves, we wanted
Well, I
them
think it
to lose
better,
this game.
yeah, like they
Obviously,
didn't care if they
yeah, they didn't care. It was a meaningless
Yeah.
game. I mean, obviously, you don't want to see your team getting blown out by 50 points. That's not questionable. Or it's just a little bit embarrassing. It is a meaningless game at the end of the day, but at the same time, these are professionals. So it does kind of suck seeing your team get blown out by 50. But the Mavericks lucked out a whole lot. I guess we'll start with this. Denver losing to the San Antonio Spurs. I know it's kind of off topic, but at the same time, like it really does tie all this in. That opened up so much for the seeding as far as the second round matchup goes, assuming the Mavericks do beat the Los Angeles Clippers. Obviously, that loss to the Spurs pretty much tied everybody up going into the final day of the regular season. And who held those tiebreakers out of those? Obviously, the Timberwolves and the Denver Nuggets and Oklahoma City Thunder. The Thunder held the tiebreaker over all three of those teams, which pretty much gave every incentive to Dallas to pretty much lose this game, and that's exactly what happened. Like I said, it's a little bit embarrassing to lose by 50 points, but needless to say, it was a meaningless game for Dallas. They probably not wanted to lose this game, but losing was probably going to happen 99% of the time, and that's exactly what we saw. But I say the only concerning point, to bring it back to the original question, the only concerning point that Mavericks fans should have about this loss or these two losses are Josh Green and Tim Hardaway Jr. Those are the only reasons why you should be concerned. Obviously, Omax had a great game. Brandon Williams had a fantastic game. AJ, he showed out pretty good. I'm not saying that any of these three guys that I just mentioned are
Alex
going to
Fudge
be
played good.
competing. Alex Fudge played it good, I guess, but I'm not saying
Yeah,
any
he
of these
did,
three
man.
guys that were mentioned are going to be cracking a playoff rotation. But if Tim, if Josh really do struggle from both ends of the floor, obviously Tim, he's not an elite defender by any means, but if he's really just a net negative, his shot isn't there. Obviously, his defense isn't going to be there. But the same goes for Josh. I'm not saying we've seen enough out of Omax to put him in the rotation, but I think we've seen enough to where if we're in a desperate time, maybe we'll see a handful of Omax minutes, at the end of the rotation. So we'll see. Obviously, he showed out those last two games, had really good games. He kind of dipped off in that Oklahoma City game. I think he got 37 or 38 minutes clocked in that game, but yeah, I think he's showcased a lot and proved a lot of fans right, really, about why he should have been in the rotation this year. At least got more minutes than he did. But yeah, like I said, the only concerning part is Tim Hardaway Jr. and Josh Green.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can obviously take their performances, with a grain of salt, given that okay, Luka and Kyrie weren't playing, the Mavericks didn't, have as much, total ball movement, team chemistry, and when they were in the game, those lineups that Josh and Tim were playing with, obviously, the not just don't have the dynamic ball handlers and Luca or Kyrie, but they obviously don't have a lot of playing time together this season. I don't think that we've seen any of the lineup combinations that we saw like in the last like two games really at any point this season. So you can sprinkle in those excuses a little bit, and of course I think with Josh in specific with him coming off of that ankle sprain, being back in Oklahoma City where that ankle sprain occurred, maybe there was a little bit of PTSD there from his vantage point because he looked extremely hesitant offensively last game, and there was a string in the second quarter. Obviously, I was kind of writing an article as I was watching this game, something I really don't do too often. I typically, if you are listening to this, Noah, chief editor over at the Smoking Cuban, I do apologize, but I don't. I tend to really focus on the Mavericks, like when I'm watching them, as much as possible. Um, and I usually don't have the capacity to be able to write while I'm watching the game unless um, there is, the game is just like got to such a meaningless juncture, that just doesn't matter like the last couple of minutes or something like that. So, that was kind of the, entire Oklahoma City game, obviously. And, I was writing a little bit in that second quarter, not like fully paying attention, but I did pay attention to a string of like five possessions of Josh Green, just, for lack of a better term, just like shitting the bed on offense and defense, like five possessions in a row. And then he got pulled out of the game. A little bit after that, I believe AJ Lawson subbed in for him. We've seen some encouraging defensive play from Josh Green. I feel like his intensity is still there. Doesn't really, there may have been, if you asked me, in that Detroit and Miami game, if he had taken any sort of dip athletically after his ankle sprain, I would have honestly told you that, he looks just as fresh as when we saw him before. He just kind of needs to get his coordination back into play and whatnot. But I don't know, against the Thunder last night, or last afternoon rather, there were a few instances where Josh got to the rim and it just did not look like he had the same explosion, particularly jumping off of like 1 foot. So I don't know. We'll see if that plays into account, whatsoever in this Clipper series. Josh obviously is going to get an entire week of rest, so I think that would be extremely beneficial for him. The Mavericks are going to get to practice during this stretch quite a bit, I presume, at least a few days. So he will get a chance to get his feet wet a lot more than he was able to coming off of that injury. Mavericks, he came back on a road trip, and the Mavericks had a very quick turnaround to finish out the regular season. I don't believe they practiced any days in there in that stretch. So this will obviously be good for Josh to hopefully get acclimated on both sides of the ball, because the heightened version of Josh Green, or the peak version of Josh Green, I should say, definitely is a guy who would have a pretty large contributory role in this Mavericks rotation, even if he is the seventh or eighth man, due to, how well Derek Jones Jr. has performed as a, on ball point of attack defender, compared to Green, that, Josh still has a pretty, solid role on this team. So hopefully that does change because the Mavericks may be forced to play Exum and Derek Jones Jr. a little bit more than they'd like. If Josh isn't his normal self, come playoff time, as unfortunate as it may be. In regards to Tim Hardaway Jr., I think that a lot more of his game can be attributed to Luka and Kyrie being out because, he does get a lot of the space that he's able to operate with on offense because of the attention that those two draw. Regardless, you don't like to see him shoot that terrible from the field. And, on top of that, he looked, when defenses are able to key in on him, especially with him, being one of the, only shot creators out on the court, in the Mavs Thunder game, you could see just, how limited he is offensively, especially because he's not a guy that is the, brightest playmaker when he gets double teamed. I'll just leave it at that. But I don't think that that's a situation, in my opinion, that is going to matter too much into the postseason. If anything, I would just be more concerned about Tim Hardaway Jr.'s, large, his shooting struggles at large over these last few months. And, I think that maybe this last 2 game stretch was obviously maybe a microcosm of that. But if go back the last couple months, his numbers have obviously, taken a dip since he was red hot in, December, January. We all, it's well documented, how bad of a shooting slump Tim was going through. He's obviously rejuvenated his shooting a little bit in this end of March, early April stretch, but it's still not at the point, that I would say that he is the high level 3-point threat that he once was. He's kind of shooting league average during this moment. So, that I think definitely in the later rounds, maybe against the Clippers, we'll obviously dive into it. But those two guys and their variability in terms of how they could play offensively could definitely swing a series for the Mavericks. Because if Tim Hardaway Jr. and Josh Green come in or firing on all cylinders, that would be huge for Dallas. But if they're not able to, then the Mavericks effectively have very little options that they can go to on their bench from the perimeter. I guess that's when those question marks that you just posed to us, Jaren, obviously a few minutes ago, in regards to if one of Lawson, Alex Fudge, even Omax, obviously Brandon Williams, even Hardy, if any of those guys would get a crack at the rotation, if we see Hardaway Jr. and Green's play continue to slump into the postseason.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as you said, it is very important that those two come alive, especially at the most important time of the year. I think Tim Hardaway Jr., he's obviously not resurged his shooting by any means, but he's gotten a little bit of that touchback. Obviously, Luka and Kyrie play such an important role for him, as you mentioned, where just in terms of floor spacing and just shot creating. Because Tim, as you said in this game, and it was a great example in this game, Tim, he's not the most creative, offensive minded individual as far as like playmaking, or even creating his own shot. He's very one minded. He sees a path, he goes to that path, and whether it gets closed or whether it doesn't get closed, he's going to take the shot either way. I will say this, obviously his shooting has bounced back slightly, since his, really, really cold shooting slump, but he's been really working hard on this little mid-range jump shot. We usually don't see him take that on the regular. Like he's obviously had that in his bag since his time in Dallas. But we haven't seen him rely on that. And I'll say this, like since
Well, I
his
would I
little
would bounce back and say that when he has been playing his best brand of basketball, he
he
routinely,
can take it.
yeah, he'll usually make about 2 or 3 a game. Like when he back in that December January stretch, you know, he's he's aware of the amount of attention that he draws as a 3-point shooter when he's rolling. He's got a little bit of a pump fake game and one dribble pull up, but when the defense isn't respecting his shot, then that's when it starts to get rough.
Well, here's my comment to that is
Yes.
that he's had a lot more, he's not just a guy that's gonna stick in the corner or that you're gonna stick in the corner and just, hopefully the ball finds him. Like he's never been that kind of guy. Like, yes, he can make corner threes and all that, but I will say this, the Mavericks have been running a lot more actions for him, I feel like, just to try and get his confidence up, to try and get him more involved in the offense. Because it was missing there for a while. And I know, especially whenever, he was having those 1 of 12 where he was just jacking up shots to jack up shots. probably Kid and like fans were we're getting pretty frustrated. And the offense just kind of deferred from him. So I will say that they have started to drop a little bit more plays for him, whether it's just curl offs in the mid range, or just these little elbow shots where it's just kind of like a screen and pass from the top of the key. Like they've gotten a lot more action run for him, and I think that that's kind of risen his confidence a little bit, and that's why we're seeing the slightest of bounce backs right now. But obviously, we want this to improve come playoff time because I'm not saying that there's one X factor for every team. There's obviously multiple X factors for every team that is in, the play-in and the playoffs. But one of which, a major X factor for the Mavericks entering this playoff series versus the Clippers is going to be Tim Hardaway Jr. Can he compete? Can he play, the brand of basketball that we expected him to play? Obviously, the last time these two teams played in the playoff series, he was hurt. Or no, he actually was not hurt. He played, right? I'm 1 year off.
No, yes,
Uh,
yeah, he played. He
yeah, he
didn't
played.
play in the
Okay, and
Mavericks' last
he was the
playoff
Mavericks'
run
second
though.
best player. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe Chris Porzingis if you want to argue that, but
No,
um,
not that series, not that.
no. Well, he still averaged like 13 points, which I'm pretty sure was more than Tim
That's true.
Hardaway.
Like Luka
Yeah.
was,
No, Luka
the
carried
sole
that team.
pioneer of that series. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but the last time, Tim Hardaway played the Clippers, obviously, yes, he was healthy. He did play. And he played well at that. But, we need him to get back to more of that, even if a little bit better off the bench. More into that six man of the year type role, which we kind of fell in love with during that December and January stretch. So obviously there's going to be a lot on his shoulders. There's going to be a lot on, or potentially a lot on like these guys like AJ Lawson, Jaden Hardy, or Omax. If they have to step into a role where Tim Hardaway Jr. and Josh Green can't fill. So, just to avoid those scenarios, obviously we need those two guys to step up. But I think that there's a lot of pressure this season on Tim Hardaway Jr.
No, certainly, and I think one of the more interesting things, especially when you take into consideration that the Maverick, one of their biggest weaknesses is their 3-point shooting off the bench, maybe even in their starting lineup at points, really kind of outside of Luka and Kyrie, just depending on how, PJ Washington, Derrick Jones Jr. are really shooting, which obviously they've shot, at a far greater rate over this last, sort of 10 games or so, especially PJ. But those are some big question marks heading into the playoffs as well. Their shooting's gonna, they definitely have that similar sort of, X factor effect, like Jaren referenced with Tim in terms of, how their shooting could swing a series. But with Tim especially, I think just due to the volume that he shoots, he's obviously in those first couple games, he's gonna come off, he's gonna have a pretty accentuated role off the bench, I would imagine. But
Yeah.
it's not like the regular season where Jason Kidd can continue to lean on Tim because he's one of the more higher dollar paid Mavericks on this roster. If he is continually flailing and he's not able to you know shoot on offense at the rate that he needs to stay in the game throughout the first couple games of this series, I wouldn't be surprised if Kid does opt to go to one of those guys, despite how much of a pretty long leash that he has given to Hardaway Jr., ever since really Kid's been with him in Dallas. So that would obviously be a pretty big story considering how, Tim's been in the rotation all year. If a change like that were to occur, either with, Tim or Josh, but there's certainly interesting situations, to look at monitoring forward. Lastly, since we've kind of got, off on a little bit of a tangent about, everybody who's injured and whatnot, I think that this has been some good discussion in regard to, you know, how much strength the Mavericks are going to have in this first round matchup versus the Clippers. Because, we talked a little bit in the intro about the Clippers about the Clippers injuries, but obviously we haven't really touched base on, on the fact that the Mavericks aren't completely 100%, even though, I wouldn't say they're near as injury riddled as the Clippers. So, lastly, obviously, in terms of injuries and whatnot, if you want to touch on Derek Lively the second, him coming back from this knee sprain, I think that his road to, getting back to full strength, especially given his age and whatnot, though I don't think that's a huge factor, just given the position he plays, his size, I think that he will not have near as many complications in terms of getting back to full strength as Josh Green will, with all the different There's a lot more that you have to take into account with, with the perimeter player, just with the amount that they're moving and stuff. But, you obviously are typically more worried about bigs getting re-injured just because of their, how large of human beings that they are doing the type of things they do. But, with Lively specifically, Jaren, um, it seems like he's going to be good to go for the first round matchup versus the Clippers. Seems like he should be able to, be back for game one, in Los Angeles. But there, is still of a sort of eerie sense around the Mavericks, staff. I think fans as well, in regard to if all that can, be accomplishable, especially when you take into consideration the recent passing of his mother and whatnot. Rest in peace to her. Obviously an amazing woman that, crafted a, very talented young man and basketball player. But, obviously, do you think that, is he going to be, ready to come back? And do you think that he will step into that, off the bench role, giving the Mavericks their 48 minutes of rim rolling, or at least having that option against the Clippers?
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess to start this off, like I think he is poised to come off the bench and have a big role in any playoff series, whether it's against Clippers or beyond, where we'll hopefully see the Oklahoma City Thunder, and then hopefully a later playoff run than that. Like I think he is poised to step off the bench and produce in any game in any series. I don't think that he'll necessarily be played out of a series. At least we haven't seen him being played out of the rotation by any means as a rookie. But as far as health concerns go, this is obviously the biggest thing. Obviously he did just recently, he's dealing with the loss of his mother, as you said before, like and a fantastic woman, and raised a very humble, and a very good. He's younger than me. I couldn't deal with losing my parents, so early in in my life. Like I wouldn't know what I would, or I wouldn't know what I would do. So obviously for him to, be, I guess, just
Lost
so
both of his
mature about
parents
it.
already.
Yeah, yeah, lost both of his parents, yeah. And obviously for him to just be so mature about it and, not necessarily humble by any means, but I think he understands, what's at stake here and whatnot. But, obviously there is some weirder, as you said, eerie, I guess comments around his knee. I think when Jason Kidd was asked about it recently, he kind of said, "We will see," or at least something along the lines of that. That kind of goes with the Ty Lue comments around Kawhi Leonard, where he said, hopefully. It's just kind of like these weird comments where you really don't know what they mean. They could mean they're back for game one, or they could mean that they're out for game one or game two or beyond. Look, I really think he will be ready. He's obviously missed 3 weeks or maybe even more than that already. With what is it exactly? Do you know exactly what the injury is?
It's just a right knee sprain.
Right knee sprain. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So nothing, of too much concern. Absolutely, there's probably a big re-injury concern
Yeah, I mean, those
surrounding
are when
Dallas.
they're phrasing injuries, that's obviously, they're saying things in very broad terms. Of course, he obviously sprained a specific muscle in his knee,
Yeah.
whether that
Yeah.
was the ACL, the PCL, the LCL. That's obviously not something that the Mavericks want to disclose because I think the optics, for instance, if he sprained his ACL, that
There'd be
typically
much more
much more worse
concern.
because of the
Yeah.
whole re-injury possibility. Even though knee sprains are typically an injury that historically we've seen guys be able to come back from and do quite well. Now I don't know exactly what the re-injury probability on that is, but Lively has had a good amount of time to rest for an otherwise not to undermine the pain or anything he's going through, but a pretty minor injury as far as like NBA basketball and whatnot is concerned. We look at, not that these are two equal caliber players, but looking at a kind of similar situation with Embiid, another 7-footer who had a knee injury late in the season. He had a partial tear, I believe, of like his MCL or something like
MCL.
that,
Yeah.
and that is typically considered um to be a little bit worse of an injury in most instances. And he's came back, and of course he's the MVP. So I mean, would be the MVP.
Yeah.
If he was able to play the entire season, and Philadelphia stayed on track based on how he was performing, up to a certain point. So, that obviously I think could maybe be some cause for, encouragement for Mavericks fans who, don't really know the exact specifications of this injury here, but yet again, like we said, we don't know exactly what happened. So, I think, Lively's only 20 years old. Everything should be good. He should be able to bounce back pretty quickly here, especially with the amount of time that he has off, especially, this week in between playoff games, something in the
Yes.
NBA traditionally, I think it was only a few day break because, obviously the play-in and whatnot now is definitely, drawn out the process of the playoffs a little bit longer, giving Lively a little bit more time even. So, I think he should be good to go, but you never know how these things could fare. We have talked injuries on here on the Mainstream Mouse podcast that have gone the complete opposite direction
Yeah.
from what we have originally thought out. So take our opinions, I guess, with a grain of salt. And we probably talked about too much for just to say that. But, at the end of the day, it is going to be interesting to see Lively's role because he has had a lot of sort of minor nagging injuries throughout really the I kind of say like last 30 to 40 game stretch of the season. He was in and out of the lineup, not just dealing with his mom's, sort of depreciating health, but also, dealing with, a ton of minor injuries, like Jaren, like you said, Jaren, it speaks to his pedigree as a young man. He's got a hell of a story if he can come back and turn this thing around. But obviously, if things do go the opposite direction, then Mavericks fans, shouldn't give up faith on Lively. We shouldn't just abandon him as our center of the future. These are pretty insurmountable odds that he's getting stacked up against that are getting stacked up against him, ahead of the playoffs. And what if he is able to fulfill that backup center role for the Mavericks? That will be crucial, I think, to them winning, especially more than I think that if Lively is not really his full self when he comes back in this first round, I think the Mavericks can still probably beat the Clippers or at least have a good chance to do so. But especially when you start to consider the second, third round of the playoffs. If the Mavericks don't have Lively at full strength or maybe he's not even mentally there, things could definitely get pretty bad for the Mavericks pretty quickly because that when you start looking at some of the opposing bigs the Mavericks could match up and having to play Gafford or Kleber having to extend them in their roles, that could definitely hurt the Mavericks over the course of a 7-game series. But that's obviously looking way ahead of things. Lively should be back. Hopefully things are good as far as that's concerned, but we will obviously see.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as we said, Lively is obviously been, one of the major heartbeats of this team throughout the season. Obviously he's dealing with a lot right now. And as you said, the odds are stacked against him. But I would be surprised if we don't see him back within the first 2 games of that series. Not saying that Mavericks need to rush anything. If it is, not that it's a major injury, but if it is an injury that, obviously takes some time to heal, I would be surprised if the Mavericks, rush things. Let's say he's meant to be out, first handful of games, and the Mavericks drop game one. I still doubt that they're going to rush things and just run them out to game two and hope for the best. I doubt that they will. They're probably going to take
This
their
is why
time
they
with
got
this injury.
Daniel Gafford essentially.
Yeah, and this is exactly why they got Daniel Gafford. 48 minutes of rim rolling is obviously going to be critical for the Mavericks late in the season. But yeah, I mean, obviously I expect him to be back healthy by game one by Sunday. Obviously, there's still a lot of time to rest. We got 6 days until the Mavericks finally tip off against the Clippers, which has felt like they have been matched up against each other for the past 2 or 3 weeks. Or at least it's been like a lock as a playoff series. But yeah, obviously time will tell as far as Clippers go too. Time will tell for them. There was a report that just recently came out as far as Kawhi Leonard goes that I guess for Mavericks fans, makes you feel a little bit better, and for Clippers fans, you have to be a little bit scared. But it's Chris Bouchard, right? That's how you say it. Yeah, he's I guess heavily connected with a bunch of the LA teams, and I know that he goes on First Take every now and then, and kind of cuts it up with Stephen A. Smith and whatnot. But he came out with a report earlier today that was basically saying that the Los Angeles Clippers are concerned with with Kawhi Leonard's knee inflammation. They're saying that it was a lot more than anticipated. It's the same knee that he had MCL or meniscus and ACL surgery on in previous years. So I think from a re-injury standpoint, there's obviously some concern there from their camp. I don't think that they're going to rush things. Obviously, Kawhi has been historically a very injury riddled character or a very injury riddled player. especially come playoff time. But only time will tell. We'll obviously see. We still have 6 days. That's the beauty of playing on a Sunday, is you have that extra day. It might not seem like much, but having that extra 24 hours can mean a lot in a playoff series. And that's, kind of what we're seeing right now. We're seeing both these teams just kind of waiting to get healthy. I mean, outside of Lively, the Mavericks aren't really dealing with many guys out. Obviously Josh Green is back. And Luka and Kyrie, those are always just those were just minor, keeping them out the last 2 games. That way they can avoid injuries. Their name
Also,
on the injury
also
list
they had
was
to
not.
list reasons
Yeah, they had to list
as to
reasons. Yeah,
why
those weren't.
they were
Yeah,
injured as
not to
means to
say this,
avoid
but they're.
fines. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly, to avoid
yeah,
fines. But
yeah.
yeah, obviously there should be no concern there. But you know, obviously hoping for a speedy recovery for Lively, especially come playoff time. I think that he will be, as you said, he will be ready for game one. And then obviously for the Mavericks, it would be, I hate, wishing on the downfall of a player, wishing against health, but it would be very resourceful if he missed a game or two, especially those first 2 games in LA. Maybe the Mavericks could take one or two, and then head to Dallas with a, big momentum lead
In
and
regards to
obviously a
Kawhi, right?
2-0 lead. Yeah, in regards to Kawhi, yes. So
Gotcha. Okay.
yeah, but
Yeah, no.
um, outside of that, that's pretty much all the injury updates I know. So
No, yeah, the Kawhi knee aspect could obviously swing a series. You did mention something about Harden and Paul George
yeah,
earlier in the pod. I had not seen anything in regards to the injuries that, or I don't know if it's an injury necessarily, but any sort of discomfort or pain that they are dealing with that could keep them out of any you know playoff matchup for the Mavericks. So if you'd like to, you can enlighten me as well as any of the listeners in regards to what those injuries were and if they have any sort of implications for the playoff series.
yeah. Obviously, I believe it was the last 3, maybe even 4 games. Both Harden and Paul George missed the like I said, the last 3 or 4 regular season games for the Clippers. I'm unclear. I think they were home for the most part, so obviously they were probably sitting on the bench. I didn't watch those games. So if there was any special report that came out, I didn't listen to that or I didn't hear that. But I will say this, in Brian Windhorst, the Hoop Collective podcast, which came out earlier today, there was some concern about James Harden, not necessarily Paul George, but some concern about James Harden, about his readiness for game one. Obviously a team that has, and Will, you mentioned this off the mic, or I guess off record, but for a team that has a lot of older guys, older veterans, that are previous stars or even still stars in this league. They like to keep those sort of injuries under wraps, even if they're minor. They like to keep them under wraps. Not let a whole lot of guys get access to that information. And that could be, just some I guess, what do you call it? That could be, I guess, just some tactics like that. But there still is some concern around Harden and his availability for game one. Obviously, as I said again, only time will tell. But the current report for both Harden and Kawhi, not that they seem unlikely for game one, but it seems like Clippers have been a little bit more concerned than probably what the traditional camp would be. But we'll obviously see. Harden hasn't played the best down the stretch. Even this season, he's had some rough stretches, and obviously, I want to say the last 20 or even 25 games of the regular season, he really did struggle. He did play throughout those games, but he struggled
There was
immensely.
one point,
Um,
I can't remember the exact stat, but it was like X amount of games, and it was pretty substantial that he had not scored like over 20 points, and it was definitely over double digit games too.
yeah, yeah.
That he
So
was under 20 points in that amount of consecutive games. So I know he, from a shooting perspective, was definitely struggling. Their offense it has not been humming to the same tune that it was earlier on this season. Part of that can maybe be attributed to the games that Russell Westbrook missed with that hand fracture. He will be back. He's been back for a little bit.
yeah,
So he analyzing that matchup in the Mavericks versus Clippers series is interesting because an article actually like went out on our site kind of about this today. But the Mavericks, I think, both when you look at this roster and historically, really don't have the best personnel to defend Russell Westbrook, in my opinion.
yeah.
Um, you know, just because of the erratic sort of play style that, he has. You need a strong, really quick dude at the point of attack. And I think Derek Jones Jr., for instance, is definitely quick, definitely has the length to guard a guy like Westbrook, but Westbrook is definitely one of the stronger guards in the league. He could easily, bully his way to the rim on a guy like that. Despite the obvious length limitations that he would have. I do think that it'll be interesting to see that matchup, with him off the bench, really against Josh Green, because I think, him and Exum are going to get a lot of minutes against, Westbrook when he's the lead ball handler off the bench for the Clippers.
Yeah, obviously Exum, Exum, Derek Jones Jr., all these guys are going to have big roles, obviously in that playoff series. I think more so for Exum, to your point, and obviously the Smoke Cupid had an article come out about this, but he's going to have a big role. I can't remember, is Westbrook starting or is he still coming off the bench for the Clippers? I honestly don't
He's
really
coming off
remember.
the bench.
He's coming off the bench, yeah. So yeah, him being matched up, or I guess Dante Exum being matched up against Westbrook is obviously going to be, one of the I guess one of the matchups that we're gonna have to watch under, a magnet, like, or not a magnet, but a magnifying scope. It's gonna be one of those matchups where, every little thing is gonna be watched. And obviously Dante Exum, he had, I guess, the luxury of guarding James Harden. I forget, was it 2018 or 2017, whenever he and it was the Rockets Utah Jazz series.
Yes.
And Exum was the main defender on Harden off the bench. Um, Obviously, Harden, I think he was the MVP that season. So obviously he was coming off, a great off season or a great offensive year. But for the most part, I know in a few games he really did give James Harden some trouble. Now, in the relation to Russell Westbrook, obviously Westbrook and Harden are two completely different guards. Westbrook uses his strength and finesse a lot more, while Harden, obviously uses that step back and his playmaking a lot more. I think the big thing for Exum is, can he stay toe to toe with Westbrook? Strength wise, can he compete strength wise with Exum or with Westbrook? Exum, not saying he's a smaller guard by any means. He has some meat on him, but I don't think we have yet to see him match up against a bigger guard, and see him not necessarily even succeed, but just see how he's been in that series. Like, he hasn't played in a
A
playoff
bigger
series.
physical card,
Yeah,
just
yeah,
from the
bigger.
standpoint that there really aren't too many bigger physical guards in the league.
No, yeah, but
I mean,
like, yeah, what the most physical, or it's coming to, or whether it's driving to the hole, or even using his little like push shot that he has sometimes. Like, he's always going to get into your chest, he's going to get into your body, and he's always going to create, a tougher, not necessarily even tougher shot than it needs to be, but he prides himself on creating these tough shots and making these, and obviously drawing fouls in the process. So I think obviously, Exum is going to have big a big task at hand, being that Westbrook has played really good this season. I think, obviously there's some disrespect here because I know that he's probably considering himself a six man of the year candidate, which I think that he should be a six man of the year candidate. I think health is the only reason that kind of kept him out of that run. But I think Exum staying toe to toe with him is going to be, obviously one of the bigger matchups that play a key in this upcoming playoff series.
nah, for sure. Um, Exum, Josh Green, like I talked about, are definitely going to see, I think, the bulk of the minutes off the bench, against, the Clippers guards, whether that's Westbrook, maybe even Bones Highlands, if he ends up getting a little bit run. Obviously, Norman Powell, those are two interesting matchups, particularly for the Mavericks, because even Norman Powell, I don't know, I think he's like 6'3", 6'4", but he's one of those bigger, more physical guards. And, we kind of talked about this. Mavericks have dealt with a variety of, lengthy guards, taller guards, whatnot. There are not many guards in the league, and it's funny that the Clippers have two of them in, Powell and Westbrook, that, are using their physicality against smaller guards to get to the rim. So the Mavericks do have a lot of bulk, at the point of attack. Even if, you know, you know, guys like Josh Green or Exum, obviously, they've, there are certain matchups, of course, where they, have been out advantaged to a certain extent, from a speed perspective. So obviously, from a, quickness, speed perspective, they, there are times, instances, that, Green, both, and Exum, maybe can't go toe to toe with some of the best in the West. But obviously, from a physicality perspective, it's going to be interesting, over the course of a 7-game series, them getting challenged in that, aspect. And, I don't think we ever necessarily, got into our preview specifically, but I think that this is a good transition point. Now that we've been talking about the injuries from the Mavericks perspective, as well as the Clippers, with Kawhi, obviously, I think it's a good time to get into the actual, intricacies of the matchups here. Now that we're kind of already talking about it, we're obviously talking about, the Mavericks' point of attack defense, off the bench, specifically against Westbrook and whatnot, and Norman Powell. But I mean, let's go ahead and jumpstart real quick to the starting lineup, because I think that is where some of the more intriguing matchups lie in this 7-game series. Especially when you look at how different, I think you referenced this in the intro, how different the Mavericks roster is compared to the last time that they played the Clippers in 2021. So there's, a lot to get into with that. Jaren, first off, who do you think is going to be defending both Luka and Kyrie?
I mean, obviously, I think it's gonna fall down to Kawhi and Paul George. I think Paul George is probably gonna be the main defender on Kawhi, or Paul George is probably gonna be the main defender on Kyrie, while Kawhi is gonna be the main defender on Luka. There is one instance where I could see the Mavericks, especially if they're getting the matchup switches that they really want. Obviously, Luka historically has torched Ivica Zubac. That's pretty much written in one of the 10 commandments is Luka Doncic will torch Ivica Zubac, but obviously they're going to try and avoid that matchup at all costs. And I think having one of Kawhi on either PJ Washington or Luka can probably, help, I guess, undermine that switch availability. Honestly, as far as the Clippers standpoint goes, I think Terrence Mann is probably, he's going to be more of a freelancing guy. I could honestly see him now looking at their starting lineup. I could honestly see him taking more of the Luka role while
I
Kawhi
could
takes the
see,
PJ
I could
Washington role.
see, I'd honestly see the opposite. I wouldn't be surprised if they'd stick a guy like Terrence Mann um, on Kyrie because I think his length, his quickness, in a situation like that, compared to I think the physicality that Kawhi has brought against Luka, would be the best bet in the Clippers instance. I think that they'd rather stick Kawhi and Luke on Luka when it really matters. Now, I think that they will also throw a variety of different looks at him. I think that you'll see Paul George on Luka, some Norman Powell on Luka. Obviously,
Yeah.
Terrence Mann, will get his that fair share of that assignment. Amir Coffey off the bench. I think he probably projects to be in the rotation. I think he'll see that assignment some. Um, yeah, I know that the Clippers, may be weary of, letting, Kawhi guard Luka a full 48 minutes, when he's doing everything that he does on the other end. But um, to give themselves the best chance to win, I think definitely in the most crucial moments of the game, of course, they're going to have to live and die with that matchup right there. And I mean, positionally, when Kawhi's healthy, he's one of the best defenders in the NBA. I think he has played Luka as physical and as well as anybody that we've seen. Even though the Mavericks have had a lot of success against the Clippers in the first round, especially Luka, obviously, there it hasn't necessarily been a causation of him being matched up with Kawhi 1-on-1 throughout the entire series, as more often than not, Clippers head coach, Tyronn Lue has strayed away from doing that, for a full game. So I'm going to be, I think that's an interesting wrinkle to see if they will do that for a full game, or if you, like you said, Jaren, they'll let like Terrence Mann, get most of the minutes on Luka, and then opt to throw maybe a guy like Norm Powell at Kyrie, mix it up with Kyrie or mix it up with Kawhi as the switch defender in any of those instances.
Well,
I'd just be
yeah.
interested to see how that goes.
No, so I bring this question up because I think, and this has historically worked out for the Clippers. I saw a stat the other day where whenever Luka scores 40 points or more against the Clippers in a playoff series, the Mavericks are only 2-3 in those 5 games that's occurred. Obviously, scoring 40 points in a playoff game is very hard to do. But I think that the Clippers, granted, this is a very different roster surrounding Luka, obviously, but I think that the Clippers might find some success doubling Kawhi or doubling Kyrie rather than Luka. I think I could see a matchup where they just try and take Kyrie really out of the series offensively. Whether that's guarding him with Terrence Mann and Kawhi or Terrence Mann and Paul George, or even throwing some Norm Powell at him, whatever it is. I could see them trying to keep Luka on a one-on-one scenario. This is me obviously just getting really into defensively. But I would be surprised if we don't see some sort of double on either Luka or Kyrie. Obviously, I think it's going to come from a trifecta, as we said, Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, or Terrence Mann. I think that those are going to be the three main defenders on those two players. I don't really see Norman Powell getting a whole lot of PT on Luka. Just I just don't think matchup wise that really works out, unless if there's obviously some like scram switch, and you can't avoid it. I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of time from Norman Powell on Luka Doncic. And then obviously, the same can be said for Ivica Zubac. I think that there's going to be a lot of, I guess, play and I guess kind of like switching the lineups as far as bigs go. Ivica Zubac was virtually unplayable the last time these two teams faced off. Obviously, the Mavericks have Gafford and Derek Lively, assuming he's healthy and ready for game one. But they obviously just signed Kai Jones. I don't think Kai Jones is going to be a playoff ready kind of guy for them, but they did sign him, I think, in
I did
preparation
not
for
know
the
that.
series. Yeah, they signed him. And like I said, I think it was in preparation of this series. Because you have Zubac, you have Daniel Tice, Mason Plumlee, I think he's healthy. And then obviously Kai Jones. So, they have a four sort of centers. I'm not saying Kai Jones will see the floor, but they have four guys that could really they can throw at the bigger Daniel Gafford or Derek Lively. I think this has been kind of a tell of what the Mavericks have built as far as a roster, signing, bigger guys, because this isn't the biggest roster in the league. Obviously, they don't really have anybody under 6'4" in the starting lineup. But this still isn't the biggest roster in the league. They don't really have a whole lot of 7-footers. Zubats, I think, is maybe scratching the surface of like 6'11" or 7 foot. Daniel Tice, same deal. I don't think that they have any 7+ footers. I may be wrong there, honestly. But adding size, adding strength, and obviously weight is something that I think that the Clippers have tried to pregame around. As far as getting a Gafford and Lively duo as far as affecting those two goes. So I know I kind of went off on a tangent, but I think that the bigs matchup will be very key and who, really walks away out of the series with the win. But to go back to your point on who's going to guard Luka, as far as one player goes, I think it'll be Kawhi. And then as far as one player goes, who's going to guard Kyrie, I think it could be Terrence Mann, probably just because he's more, as you said, he's much more of a guard defender, and then I could see PG on like PJ Washington or Derek Jones Jr., depending on who's having a hotter series as far as offense goes.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that like when the going gets tight though, you'll see that, Luke or that Kawhi PG on Luka, Kyrie matchup defensively from the Clipper standpoint.
Yeah.
Even another wrinkle that we didn't really get into, and we don't have to explore this too much, but I think the Clippers would probably throw Westbrook on Kyrie defensively a lot too, especially, he's had the opportunity off the bench to be a defensive anchor for them. He has the rare sort of, even at his age, 34, 35, whatever he is, that rare breed of athleticism, to that where he's honestly, in different ways, obviously, but quicker, even more explosive than Kyrie. He I think historically, I think they both had a lot of respect for each other. I know that Kyrie, obviously, there was there was a pregame instance one time earlier, either this season or another season, where he came out and sort of dapped up Westbrook and gave him his flowers. They're two kind of polarizing figures in the public perspective, as far as basketball goes, both due to, I think, kind of how they operate with the press, or as well as kind of how, at least in Westbrook's case, and I think what a lot of people thought in Kyrie's case, but it obviously hasn't been the case, how their play has depreciated over the last couple of years. And like I said, that's not the case in Kyrie's instance, but I think a lot of people were projecting that sort of eventual downfall upon him. So they're two sort of very similar figures. So I think that their sort of mutual respect for each other will be interesting to see. But I also do think that because of that, Westbrook, especially with the amount of time that he's guarded Kyrie, just having been in the league longer than a lot of guys that the Mavericks may see in this playoffs. The Clippers do have a pretty they have a pretty studded veteran roster. So they obviously are probably one of the highest average ages in the NBA. So I think that that whole playoff experience deal. If we kind of want to just tie in right there, that obviously could be a factor. The Mavericks themselves obviously have a lot of playoff experience, just strictly between Luka and Kyrie. But barring that, you're looking at a lot of guys, it being maybe either their second or third series in a ever being in the playoffs. Maybe in like the instance of like Derrick Jones Jr., like his first time having a substantial starting role in a playoff series. You look at a guy like PJ Washington, it is his first playoffs just in general. I think Gafford's played like one playoffs before. And, these are some of the, veteran figures on this Mavericks roster that, have little to no playoff experience. Obviously, when we're looking at the, best players in the series and the amount of poise that the Mavericks have carried themselves with in the clutch this year, it shouldn't be something that, weighs too heavily as a factor. Especially, when you take into consideration that, like Gafford, Washington, all those guys are not like rookies or anything. They've been in the league a few years. They are ready for this moment, even if they haven't, gotten the most playoff experience. But it would be interesting, to see if the Clippers poise obviously is something that carries over, at the end of games, if it's something that they have an advantage over, with compared to the Mavericks. I don't, like I said, I don't anticipate that being too big of an issue because of how well the Mavericks played in the clutch. I think Luka and Kyrie are, enough of a, sort of stabilizing force to prevent anything like that from really having, a significant impact on the series. But it was something that I obviously wanted to bring up. Um, what do you think the dynamics of the first couple games could look like if Kawhi actually does end up, missing, say, a couple games? Do you think, um, you know, how advantageous could that be for the Mavericks?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if Kawhi misses a couple games, that comes at the sacrifice of a lot of guys on the Clippers team. Like Amir Coffey's gonna have to step up. They might have to rely on, maybe a little bit more offense out of Bones Highland. He's traditionally not in their lineup,
Maybe
or
some
even their
Kobe
rotation.
Brown or Brandon
Yeah,
Boston.
yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe like some of these guys, like they're younger guys, like they might have to step up. I know Amir Coffey, I think he's like actually like in their rotation. So maybe not so much for him, but yeah, I mean, a guy like Brandon Boston, obviously, we don't watch the Clippers as much as we watch the Mavericks, so there might be a guy that we're just completely blanking on. But one of those guys, they're gonna have to step up and play a bigger
PJ
role.
Tucker, what is he gonna
And
get
no,
minutes?
I mean, but PJ Tucker doesn't even play for them. So
No, he
I
doesn't
would
really
be
even play for
curious
them.
if
So
he's played into a series like this where, the Mavericks, I would say, have more size. I guess they're pretty even on size, but I could see a scenario where
well, I mean,
PJ
I
does
yeah,
miss
I
it.
think that the Mavericks, I would say the Mavericks have more size, if in the bigs department
Yeah,
because you're looking at the variability of Zubac getting played off the floor, just being too slow footed to guard Luka, and that whole pick and roll matchup being just too much of a problem. I could see the Clippers, um, maybe taking him off the court. But then do the Mavericks, try to play small ball, or would they try to, really inflict their size, upon the Clippers? I think that that's a very prevalent question that, even though I think the Mavericks do like marginally have more size than the Clippers. When you look at Lively, Gaffer, they're both like two starting level centers in Dallas's rotation. I mean, even Kleber, not a center obviously, but I mean he's sort of a hybrid big. And some nights he plays as if he is starting caliber. So that is big for the Mavericks. I think I'd probably take that over the core of Zubac, Plumlee, and Tice, just from a defensive standpoint. But
yeah,
Plumlee and Tice are good on ball defenders, even though they're not really, they don't have the size to be um, the sort of rim protectors that I think that the Clippers you know would covet. I think that the Mavericks you know I think that their combination of rim protection and rim rolling, as well as just their, pure size when you look at their centers, could definitely be something that the Clippers, for long stretches, could easily hurt them, especially if, Gafford, or Lively for that matter, are able to, at least hold their own, having to guard small ball lineups on the other end. I think it could be fairly quickly that the Clippers, revert to small ball, especially with the history that we have with Luka and Zubac. They may not even like let that matchup happen. We don't really necessarily know, how that's all going to unfold, or like like I said, maybe they start Plumlee, so you're lacking in rim protection a little bit more compared to Zubac, just from the pure size standpoint, but you have a better on ball defender on a guy like Luka when they get switched. So that will be an interesting wrinkle to see. If the Clippers like go total small ball, kind of like they did with the Mavericks a couple years ago, to where it basically completely remediated, Kristaps Porzingis and his effect in the game just due to him not being enough of a physical presence, and the Mavericks sticking him in the corner on offense. I that obviously could present more of a challenge. Um, if the Clippers are playing five out and not one of Dallas's big start to struggle, guarding. But we saw a team go small ball against the Mavericks, fairly somewhat recently in regular season history, when the Suns did it, and because Yusuf Nurkic was getting played off the court by Luka, very similar style big to Zubac. And even though Zubac is definitely a better defender, um, we saw that happen. I believe right after the All-Star break in that Mavericks versus Suns game that Jaren and I actually went to. Um, and the Mavericks ended up playing a lineup with both Kleber, and Gafford, if I remember correctly, that provided enough prowess from a rebounding and rim protection standpoint, and really didn't sacrifice much defense on the perimeter. Gafford did a pretty good job, sticking with the likes of Durant, whoever was the Mavericks or the Suns small ball five whenever he got matched up. Like I was pretty surprised at how well he was able to defend. I mean, there were obviously a couple times that a guy like KD is going to beat him off the dribble, but overall, I think it'll be interesting to see if the Mavericks are willing to inflict their play style more on the Clippers, or if we see them try to, match that five outlook if the Clippers do end up reverting it, to it. Because I do think, while Zubac, he is a big body, I could see him maybe out rebounding, um, the likes of Lively, particularly off the bench, just because, he's maybe not as stout of a presence as Gafford from a physical standpoint. I don't think the Mavericks, but just with the amount of size that they have in their starting lineup, um, I don't think that they'd lose too much on the glass against the Clippers because, if Kawhi's healthy, maybe that is a different story because he's historically like been a pretty damn good rebounder, especially in the playoffs. And he has the size and the hands to get some pretty crazy rebounds. So, with him and PG all in there, I could see that, scaling the Clippers intensity up a little bit on that end, but otherwise, I honestly think the Mavericks may have the luxury to really be able to inflict their size upon the Clippers and not get tripped out, by them playing small ball and not have to revert to small ball with Kleber at the five for really long stretches because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's honestly a very interesting point that you do bring up about the Clippers small ball five. And the big thing about having Kawhi Leonard healthy is you can run that small ball five whenever Kawhi Leonard is in the lineup. I have seen at times where, either it's PJ Tucker or Kawhi Leonard where they'll run him at the five, one of those two guys at the five, and it's kind of just a run and gun play style. Obviously, Kawhi can pretty much guard 1 through 5, if you really need him to. So honestly, that's a very interesting wrinkle that you brought up. But to the point of the Mavericks, I think that the Mavericks, assuming Kawhi Leonard misses a game or two, with that knee, their size on the Clippers and really taking advantage of a Kawhi-less Clipper squad in the rebounding department, in the paint department down low. And if the Mavericks can take the first game, even first two, in LA, obviously we saw the Mavericks in 2021 give up a 2-0 lead at home. But this is a completely different roster. This is a roster built for playoffs, and built for playoff success. And I could see the Mavericks really holding on to a lead like that. So that's why, I'm trying to, shorten it down a little bit. But having Kawhi Leonard healthy for the Clippers is going to be absolutely pivotal, for matchup success and also just for, game success in general. Obviously, I'm not expecting him to play. Let's say, he is back by game one. I'm not expecting him to play 45 minutes in that first game. They're probably going to not ease him into it, but they're going to ease him more into it, probably give him a 35-minute game, rather than, pushing it to 40, 42, however much or however many they probably need him to play. They're probably gonna, cut it off at a certain point. So, either way, if Kawhi is back, I mean, he literally is a cyborg. Like he comes back in series, he can miss a month. Like last year, he missed like a full month before the playoffs, came back, and by game one, he looked like Kawhi Leonard. And, you know, obviously he didn't finish that series out because he tore his meniscus. But, you know, I just don't really know what to expect if Kawhi Leonard is out. If he is out, I expect the Mavericks to take game one or game two, depending on how long he is out. I don't expect him to be out the full series unless that this is just a very concerning, very major injury that we honestly nobody knows about. If it is a torn ligament or something like that. But I don't see him missing, substantial amount of time. And, whenever he does come back, that's where we're going to see the Clippers at their full strength, obviously. And we're going to see the Clippers probably run their best lineups against the Mavericks. So I do like how you brought that up about the small ball five, because they do have the luxury to bring that up. Assuming PJ Tucker, not saying he's prime PJ Tucker or anything like that, but, with him, being a Clipper, you can obviously run that. But I think Kawhi needs to be in the rotation and in that lineup if you're going to run a small ball five.
Yeah, I don't think that. No, they don't have like Robert Covington anymore, for instance. He was kind of in his prime during that 2021 series or at the tail end of it. The Clippers, I don't think have as much positional size as they used to.
Yeah,
Um,
they've been gutted as far as like, depth has gone.
yes, no, to a certain extent. We're seeing some of their young players really step up. Like I think Kobe Brown and Brandon Boston are really intriguing. Whether Ty Lue would trust either of those guys in a playoff series at large, I think remains to be seen. I know they've kind of both been on the fringes of the rotation all season. So that'll be an interesting dynamic. But the Clippers, obviously in their starting five, we'll get into a little bit in terms from the Mavericks defensive standpoint. With Kawhi and PG, you're probably going to see Derrick Jones Jr. and PJ Washington on those two, obviously, in any sort of, combination, in terms of who's guarding who. I think that could definitely vary. But if I had to guess, I'd probably say PJ would get a bulk of the minutes on Kawhi, just given the strength aspect and being, a little bit more stronger, lengthier than DJJ. I think, Derrick Jones Jr. with his length, also granted that I think Paul George plays a little bit more of a finesse style compared to, Kawhi Leonard in terms of, he's a little bit more, prone to, settling for mid-range jump shots and, three-pointers and whatnot. I don't think that's necessarily bad. They're typically good looks, and he has an insane dribble package. But, a guy like Derrick Jones Jr., I think would be better equipped to, giving, he's not the strongest guy in the world to guard a guy like PG. That kind of leaves, the Clippers in terms from an offensive perspective, obviously with James Harden as the big X factor in that lineup. The Mavericks are going to, obviously, in their starting five, probably going to throw, they're going to have to throw one of Luka or Kyrie at James Harden. I would probably assume Kyrie, just because he obviously has, played with Harden before, knows his tendencies. He is a little bit at a size disadvantage. Luka would have a lot more strength in that matchup, but Harden's game, especially at his age now, I think it's a lot less predicated, on the physical side of things in terms of his ability to get to the rim. He's not near as explosive as he once was. I think that the Mavericks would, definitely have a better bet sticking Kyrie on him. With the way that Harden has operated as, really these last two seasons as, like you said, this guy who, is a pick and roll maestro, from, a perspective of being able to find, thread the needle, find those nooks and crannies in the defense. He's really good operating, in that situation with Zubac, finding the kick out man. And that's always been, one of Harden's, better assets, but he's obviously just less explosive getting to the rim. He's going to have a tendency to settle for those step back threes more. And I think, with his, obviously Kyrie's undersized, but we've, talked about this. He is an above average defender. Sometimes he occasionally will have some defensive lapses that I think are largely tied to his offensive workload and, maybe him just not having it all the way for a possession. But in a playoff series where everybody's going balls to the wall, I think, especially with the way Harden's depreciated offensively, he's probably going to be your best bet there from the quickness aspect of things. And, at that point, obviously Gafford would, guard Zubac. And that probably leaves Luka as the guy, defending Terrence Mann in their starting lineup, presumably. And you live with that any day of the week when you're talking about
Yeah.
the Clippers matchup. He may get his on Luka every once in a while, may catch him slipping on some backdoor cuts every now and then. Well, overall, the way Luka has been playing defense this season, that's a matchup that the Mavericks are comfortable with. They've had some a little bit of a history in terms of getting at each other. So I'd be curious to see if any of that gets invigorated or sparked during this series, because I think that they'll be on each other a lot on both ends of the court.
Yeah.
So that I think that'll definitely be Dallas's best bet. But it's going. There's almost like too many matchup sort of like components to really get into until we see the actual game being played, because the with these two rosters, I there's a lot to prove on both sides. And seeing, I think, just how ready the Clippers are from an offensive perspective, seeing some of the actions that they're going to choose to run against Dallas, you know just how involved PG and Kawhi are at the point of attack versus Harden setting up the offense. These are all going to be game to game, things that we're going to get into this series. There's a lot of different things that I think the basketball, will sort of have to fine tune for us to discuss. But just from, face value, sort of aspect, I do think the Mavericks match up pretty well defensively with the Clippers. Just if you're kind of going throughout that starting five, we obviously talked about, I think, where the, Dallas's biggest weak point could be, is that gap off the bench in terms of their point of attack defense. And then, both on the other side of things with 3-point shooting. If Tim Hardaway Jr., Josh Green, even Exum, we haven't really seen him at a high volume in a playoff series do this before. If they're not shooting the three well, and on the flip side, their point of attack defense isn't where it needs to be. That could be where the Mavericks lose, within the margins. Simple as that. But I do think the Mavericks probably have the personnel, the camaraderie, as well as the better top two in this series. And I do think that they're going to come out on top in the end. I think that they have a talented enough roster to beat the Clippers. I think they match up extremely well. The aspect of, or the wild card of Kawhi's health, I think, is an uncomfortable thing heading into the series for the Clippers. It's not something that they would want at all, obviously, and something that they've had to deal with in the past time and time again come playoff time. So, I think the Mavericks do have the momentum, especially with how they've been playing recently, to take this thing home. But that's not to say that, the Clippers veteran experience, or any of these guys for that matter, between Harden, Westbrook, even Paul George, having a sort of throwback series could derail that pretty quickly.
I mean, if the Mavericks are going to have not necessarily any chance in this series, but if they want to have any chance at, winning confidently against this, pretty loaded Los Angeles Clippers squad, obviously the defensive matchups that we just talked about are going to need to be, I guess as vocal as a vocal point can be. I mean, obviously, Kawhi Leonard, his health is, uncertain to say the least, but, as far as Dante Exum's matchup versus Westbrook, obviously how can Kyrie exploit, whether it's a double team or, their one-on-one matchup versus those the star players that we just mentioned, how can they exploit that? It's all going to come down to, I guess the marginal aspects of the game. Obviously these are professionals. They're amazing. They're the best of the best at their craft. And even from a coaching perspective, as far as Jason Kidd and Ty Lue goes, I know Ty Lue has coached a lot bigger games compared to Jason Kidd. This is the first time where the Mavericks have faced off against the Clippers with Jason Kidd as the head coach. So this will be, and as far as that perspective goes, I guess it'll be interesting to see. The Clippers, outside of obviously getting Westbrook and a handful of other guys, they relatively have the same squad outside of, a few guys leaving and a little bit of a more star-studded roster as far as James Harden goes. They have a relatively same squad as they did. So, obviously there's going to be a lot on the line for the Mavericks and for, the Clippers, obviously. I don't want to say who's going to have, I guess, a bigger weight on their shoulders as far as the Clippers or Mavericks go, but I think if you're looking at it, especially at an age perspective, it probably falls more on the Clippers as far as a heavy perspective. So we'll obviously see how things go. Sunday, obviously is the first game, and we'll know a lot more probably as the week goes on, about Kawhi, about James Harden, and about Derek Lively II, as far as their availability goes. But I know on the agenda today, we kind of wanted to talk about the Pistons game and obviously that Thunder game, which we kind of discussed a little bit. So I figured we get into a little bit. I watched the Pistons game. I didn't watch the Thunder game. While Will, you didn't watch the Pistons game and you did watch the Thunder game. So I guess we can give our input as far as that goes. Obviously, playing the Pistons, I want to say the only two guys that were out were Luka and Kyrie. I think PJ definitely played. DJJ played. Gafford played. Obviously, Derek Lively, he's been hurt. But outside of that, pretty much every rotational player that was available for the Mavericks outside of Luke and Kyrie were available. They didn't play past the first quarter, as far as Gafford goes, past the first quarter, and then for most of the other guys past the past the first half rather. But even still, it was a little bit concerning from that standpoint. I know at the top of the podcast we're kind of questioning whether fans should be concerned or not, and the answer obviously came down to no. These were two meaningless games, but at the same time, you lost a 14-win team, or at that time a 13-win team, in pretty dominant fashion. A little embarrassing from that standpoint, and then obviously to lose to Oklahoma City and OKC. As you said, they held a 58-point lead at one point. Um, so from that standpoint, it was obviously a little bit embarrassing, but I think the big question that has come out of this is obviously the availability of Josh Green, Tim Hardaway, and Jaden Hardy, which we've already gotten into a little bit. But I think that's the bigger question that should be asked, not necessarily the game result of these two games, because I think PJ, he had a pretty solid game for the minutes that he played. DJJ, he didn't really get much run. Gafford, I mean, without Luka and Kyrie, he's kind of not useless by any means, but he's just kind of a hard player to really watch without those two guys creating for him. And kind of the same goes for every rotational player. But the real concern should be Josh Green, Tim Hardaway Jr., and then obviously Jaden Hardy. I know we kind of wanted to get into Jaden Hardy a little bit, which is why we're kind of covering this game content right now. But yeah, I mean, obviously a little bit concerning. The Mavericks cut it down to 8 points, I want to say early in the fourth or even late in the third. And outside of that, that was pretty much the only effort that the Mavericks had given throughout that whole entire game. Alex Fudge got his first, or no, he actually didn't get his first points. He got his first points in the Thunder. He almost had his first points before he traveled like half the court, and missed the layup in the process. Not to throw any dirt on him or anything, but or throw any
Played a lot
mud.
better in the Thunder game.
No, I'm not surprised, but
Yeah.
but yeah, there obviously Omax had a really good game against the Pistons. He had that monstrous posterizer
Yeah.
over
Jalen Duran.
Wiseman. Or
It
no,
was
yeah,
Wiseman. Yeah, you're right.
yeah, it
You're
was
right.
Wiseman.
You're
Yeah,
right. You're right.
where Wiseman like hacked the shit out of him for better, for better or worse. Like he clobbered his face. No foul call. There obviously should have been. I want to say Omax. I may be wrong here, but I want to say his lip was bleeding or his nose was bleeding, one of the two. Or there may have been not blood at all. But yeah, he got clobbered. But made one of the prettiest posters as far as the Maverick season goes. Yeah, but besides Omax's performance, there really wasn't anything provocative that came out of that game. Obviously, it was game 81 of 82 in the regular season, and the Mavericks already had a locked up playoff series versus the Clippers, so they weren't really playing for much. But you would have liked to see more of in that game. I know AJ actually had a pretty decent game against the Thunder, but you would have liked to see more out of him or a guy like Brandon Williams, like one of those guys coming off the bench, not playing many time. You would have liked to see more come out of them, but having Omax play solid, and obviously have that, insane poster dunk over James Wiseman, I guess is kind of all you can ask for in a game 81 of 82 scenario versus the worst team in the league. So
Yeah. Well, Hardy scored 25 points in that game. So
yeah, he had a quiet 25. Like he was like making threes, but outside of that, not playing very well. Like it was kind of a weird game. Hardy, yeah, I guess he did have a solid game.
Yeah.
But it was kind of like just because he got so much, as far as offensive perspective, he got a lot of attention. So
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean that makes sense. And I think these last two games with Luka and Kyrie out, if anything, just the way in which the Mavericks lost, the fashion, losing by like over 40 to OKC, losing by 19, 18, whatever it was to Detroit. I think that it really does. I mean, for most Mavs fans, probably heightens the awareness of the lack of the third ball handler, for the Mavericks. Obviously, Exum, has shown the ability to create and, he is a guy that can get downhill and, make plays for guys. But in terms of, having a true playmaker and shot creator off the bench, the Mavericks really, don't have a guy that does both of those at, that, sort of six-man level that, would be idealistic. Now, I wouldn't say it's a, true hole of their team, but having a guy like Hardy, potentially step up into that role one day, especially, during the Luka and Kyrie era, at least while Kyrie is still in Dallas or, still performing at this level, however many seasons we have left of that. I think that development is one that, will be huge because I think that definitely will matter at some point for the Mavericks. And, Hardy's performance in the Thunder game, there wasn't really anything substantial to take from the Thunder game. The Mavericks obviously struggled to get into their offensive sets, with these lineups that they haven't played together all season. And I think that was the same in the Pistons game, just from, a lack of familiarity, especially with Luka and Kyrie out of the lineup. That's just such a bulk of the Mavericks offensive creation right there. That's, gone in these two different games. But, particularly in that Thunder game, the Mavericks were like devoid of, a real offensive creator. And I mean, they just found a tough time to get into their sets. And honestly, from a spacing perspective, from the way you're setting guys up, as well as, just how he operated within the flow of the offense, as well as the pick and roll. Brandon Williams, I thought, did a much better job than Hardy in that that regular season finale game versus OKC. Then, that's not to say that either of them, played the greatest game. I believe Brandon Williams finished with like 8 of 21 shooting, but he had like a ton of in and outs, that looked like good shots. And he had a few like really tough buckets that, we have, seen him, do this really all season for the Legends as well as the Osceola Magic. I mean, he's, probably a lot of Mavericks fans don't know too much about him, but, he's pretty dynamic guard that's been out for 2 years in the NBA for the most part, kind of just getting back in the G League due to an injury in 2021-22 when he kind of got a jump start with Portland in his NBA career. So I would say, I would keep an eyeball on him to see if, he at any point comes into any playoff game for the Mavericks. Actually, I take that back completely. I hate to do this, but he is a two-way. So I forgot that two-way guys are ineligible for the playoffs. So I shouldn't even have thought of that. But I guess a way to piggyback off of that, Hardy, seeing how he plays in the playoffs will be really interesting, if he ends up getting time, because there could be, instances, especially, against the Clippers with the amount of perimeter, defense that they have, the ability to throw at Dallas. Maybe the Mavericks may need to, get some more creation in their lineup throughout, stretches. I mean, Hardy has been at the sort of fringes of Dallas's rotation, all year, kind of in that ninth man spot, getting PT in some games, but maybe a D and PCD the next game and whatnot. Seeing his role, how or if he even has a role, or could he blossom into one, will be a very interesting development in this series. If he's playing the way he was playing in that OKC game, now granted, they obviously have like I think a top 3 defense, as well as just some of the better defensive personnel from perimeter, both in interior perspective. When you take into consideration who the Mavericks were, suiting up, with the White Pal having to, battle up against Chet. He got cooked. So I'm just gonna say it was bad, but this is not anything against the White Pals. He adds a great brand of, morale as well as camaraderie to this Mavericks team off the bench that cannot be underscored. So we will not hit on Dwight Powell until the Mavericks lose in the playoffs. You guys got that much from us. But no, I mean on the real, with the Hardy situation, I think that he has obviously gone through a bit of a sophomore slump. Even if you kind of look at the shooting numbers and scale it to his rookie year, his field goal percentage as well as his 3-point percentage are both down marginally. And, he's actually even playing a little bit less minutes per game this season than his rookie season. Now, he obviously played in a lot more games this year, but, could that, he could, I'm not going to say he's an X factor in this Mavericks versus Clippers series, but, he's a big wild card in my opinion, if he gets in the game, because he could be a guy that I think Jason Kidd could, quickly take out of a series if he comes in and Hardy is, sort of agenda setting and is trying to get his own shot a little bit too much and is not really, is disrupting the flow of the offense to a certain extent and is not cashing in his attempts like we've seen throughout, certain stretches throughout his career when he's not playing his best brand of basketball, or he could be, a huge spark plug if he comes in and has like one good game. So I think he's a hugest wild card in this series, but that's not to say that he's going to have a role. I think it's definitely going to vary. And, especially when we talk about, a guy like, AJ Lawson, because or Omax, because those are guys, AJ's now in the standard contract, so he can play in the playoffs. And Omax obviously was with the Legends some, but, he's on a rookie deal. He can certainly play in the playoffs. I think, either Tim or Josh, sort of depreciating in play could certainly, swing their playing time. But, other than that, we could sit here all day and really just break down tit for tat this entire matchup versus the Mavericks, get into the history with everything, and especially, with that, all the data that we have with these teams having played, these two teams having played twice. But I mean, these are two different teams, even if, only kind of around the margins. Well, I'd say more so in the Clippers case, because the Mavericks,
Yeah.
Have Kyrie, and Brunson was not playing at the level that he is right now when he was on, especially in that Clippers series when Rick Carlisle was, barely playing him in that series.
And in the first series, he didn't even travel with the
No,
team to the
yeah,
Mavericks. So,
exactly. So,
yes.
I mean, that's, a totally different look now. That the Mavericks have two dynamic ball handlers. Will be a lot harder for the Clippers to defend, like without a doubt. But there are a lot of different factors, like we talked about, in terms of some of the Mavericks' weaknesses, maybe their point of attack and 3-point shooting. No, I said that way too fast. Their point of attack defense and 3-point shooting off the bench, being a little bit lackluster, could come into fruition. Or, if the Clippers are really able to exploit the Mavericks with a small ball lineup, if Kawhi Leonard's at full strength, and all the Clippers 3-and-D guys are, playing up to par, is that something that just sort of remediates all the size that the Mavericks had this trade deadline? I mean, we'll go to, it'll only show with time, but the Mavericks have been playing some of the best basketball out of any team recently. So, I like our odds going into this one, Jaren. We
Yeah.
could, like I said, we're gonna break down these matchups a ton more, when we get into the games and we actually get to see what happens, because
Yeah.
we can only do so much forecasting before the actual basketball is played. But we'll certainly have more on this series. Maybe if it's not necessarily matchup analysis, because, that's basically what we did for a good hour and a half here today. But we will talk maybe about, some of the more narrative based aspects of this series, because we went heavily into the sort of basketball stuff today. We could, we got a couple more podcasts, I'm sure, before this series really kicks off. We'd like to get at least like 2 or 3 more out this week. So, we're really excited to, ramp these up as we, have been saying, but especially now that the playoffs are really on the precipice with the regular season here to close. And, we'll go ahead and end the podcast with our official predictions for the series. I know I said I thought the Mavericks are likely going to win a series, but in terms of specific amount of games, I'm going to go ahead and say Mavs in 6. I think third time's a charm. I think, when you take into consideration just at large how the Clippers have played throughout this, sort of post All-Star trade deadline stretch, compared to the Mavericks, it is night and day. But, the juxtaposition of that is obviously the Clippers played, much better at the beginning of the season, while, the Mavericks didn't. So there's a lot of narratives to unpack, over the next couple podcasts for sure. But if we're just bringing down matchups, who's the better team, as well as, who I genuinely think is the more talented team at this stage in the season. I think it is the Mavericks, and I'm going to go ahead and say, Mavericks win in 6 in the first round.
Yeah. I'm gonna follow you, and I'm gonna say third time's a charm. I think the Mavericks take care of business. It's obviously gonna be a tough grind out sort of series, whether Kawhi is playing or not playing. But I'll go with Mavs in 6. However, if Kawhi misses, a substantial amount of time, 3 or 4 games, for instance, I think the Mavericks take care of business in 5. Obviously PG, Harden, they're great players in their own right. I just don't think that they have any say, or maybe PG, but I just think that with Harden's depreciation, especially over this season, I just think it's really hard to see them win more than two
Yeah, and
games
I
without
mean,
Kawhi.
obviously PG is still, an all-star caliber player for
Yeah,
sure, but he's
absolutely.
depreciated offensively a little bit over the last couple seasons. I mean, I think he's like 33 now.
Yeah,
He's definitely adapted in other senses. Like we said, he's, his, finesse and his, and honestly, like his dribble package and especially some of his step back threes that he's been taking, really over the last couple years, I think have been something that, he's shown off to a premium. But his ability to get to the rim, especially, with some of the injuries he's had throughout the course of his career, I mean, it goes without saying that he's not the same player that he was when he was 28, 27, even when, a couple years ago when he was in the bulk of his prime. And the Mavericks, it was like 2020, 2021. I think that was right after the Mavericks Clippers series, or during the Mavericks Clippers series, obviously. I think PG was probably like 30 or 31, tail end of his prime. And, you know, he was, had the notorious sort of playoff P thing that happened back then with him, really stinking it up in the playoffs from, shooting perspective. I think he's a little older now. He's a little bit more stable. I don't know if we'll have, he's got a podcast now. He's got reasons to uphold the standard a little higher. It was a bubble scenario. I don't think we'll see anything like that, but conversely, like I said, I just him not being the same player that he was a couple years ago in terms of at least having that aspect of you know real vintage Paul George being able to step into effect, both athletically as well as from a shot making perspective. I just don't know if he can do it fully athletically, especially with the amount of length and athleticism the Mavericks have defensively. It's not like I'd say the Mavericks definitely have a more healthy blend of athleticism, rim protection, all that sort of stuff, length on defense than a vast majority of the teams in the league at this juncture. So, I don't know if PG is necessarily going to go absolutely nuts, but if he taps back into vintage Paul George, and I'm sure certainly Kawhi is still vintage Kawhi, yeah, for lack of a better term. Either of those two factors could definitely throw things off. But like I said, I do think the Mavericks still take the tape here. I think that they still just matchup wise are just a superior team. If with the way Kyrie and Luka are playing compared to if like I said, basically everything I just said, if you want to unpack it into like one or two sentences, like I honestly think the Mavericks top core and their surrounding role players are better than the Clippers top core and surrounding role players. And,
Yeah,
simple as that.
yeah, I couldn't
Yeah.
agree more. And I think that the Mavericks, especially Oklahoma City granting the first seed, or I guess clinching the first seed. Obviously, we don't know who they'll play yet. It'll be, obviously between the playing games, which will be held tomorrow. But obviously, the Mavericks, could be well on their way for a deep playoff run. They just have to get through the Clippers first. Obviously, they're shifting their focus on the Clippers. Probably not even game planning for Oklahoma City at all, or game planning for the Lakers. Whoever does get that 8 seed, they're not even worrying about that right now. They're obviously worrying heavily about the Los Angeles Clippers. But maybe in a month or two we'll be getting more of these. We never know. For those YouTube viewers, you obviously see on the camera. For those Spotify and Apple Podcasts, I'm holding up a 2011 championship hat. So maybe we'll be getting more of these here soon. Obviously, it's a long shot with Denver and Boston being as dominant as they are. But
Hey, this
we can dream.
star of the Mainstream Mavs podcast, coming
This is
back,
our first
something
playoff game,
special.
our first playoff coverage. So
It is our first
yeah.
playoff coverage, and it couldn't be at a better time. We're more excited than ever. Hopefully, us coming back is an omen for the Mavericks' success. Though that is unlikely because we started our podcast in a season where the Mavericks went 38-44. So we'll
Yeah, I
see.
think we're the bad omen, but
Yeah,
we'll see.
yeah.
And they're
Exactly.
0-2 since, well, no, I guess we started before it. So they're 2-2
Yes.
because Charlotte and Miami, we started it. I guess we started it before those two
Yeah.
games. So
Let's go ahead and keep the fingers crossed, knock on wood, all the superstitiousness. We'll see what happens. But this has been Will and Jaren with the Mainstream Mouse podcast. A little bit all over the place covering this Clippers matchup because we didn't really know how much coverage the Pistons and the Thunder game really deserved. But I honestly think we did a pretty good job of covering everything on all facets. Like I said, we'll get into some of the more narrative driven stuff here in the next couple of podcasts. As I think those are some very interesting components of this as well. And then we'll start doing our game coverage of these podcasts. And couldn't be a better time to be back. We have some exciting things that we may do with the podcast, especially surrounding those games that we have yet to really get into. So I think our coverage around but these playoff games, both from writing as well as on the mic perspective, is going to be a lot more dynamic than it has been in the past, even when we were podcasting. So that's something for y'all to look forward to. Will and Jaren, Mainstream Mavs, once again signing out.
bye bye.